Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773. The spark that ignited American independence. A comprehensive historical narrative, a turning point in history. The Boston Tea Party was an act carried out on the night of December 16, 1773. One that would completely alter the course of world history. An event that would be spoken of across generations. A symbolic deed, an emblem of freedom and the discovery of identity, and from that day forward, a symbol of the transformation of global trade. In this video, we tell the story of those tea chests that plunged into Boston Harbor on that cold winter night. Chests that were not merely a protest, but in truth a rebellion, the first spark of freedom's flame. The story of a people stripped of legitimate representation, of a people's longing for liberty, of rage against oppression, of decades of accumulated resentment and desire for freedom finally taking its first steps, and the transformation of a society's habits. That too, we will tell in our second video. This event became the first spark of the independence of the United States of America, the moment a society found its identity. And that is precisely why it stands as one of the most pivotal turning points along the long and arduous road toward independence. To truly understand this event in its full depth, looking only at the year 1773 is not enough. The roots of what happened stretch back years before to the colonization of the North American continent by the powerful states of Europe, to the structure of the economic relationship between England and these colonies, and to the deeply fundamental differences in the political ambitions and governing philosophies of both sides. In this video, we wish to tell you, in the spirit of an enjoyable, immersive story, the full background of the Boston Tea Party in all its detail, how the events unfolded, what transpired on that night, and the historical consequences that would shake an entire continent. Those roots must be examined because the real story lies there. Life in colonial America and British rule. Sails unfurled into the unknown from the early 17th century onward. British colonists began settling along the shores of North America. Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, became the first permanent English settlement, while in 1620 the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts aboard the Mayflower. These first emigrants consisted of Puritans fleeing religious persecution, merchants seeking economic opportunity, and company employees sent by England. The birth of the colonies. When a group of Englishmen set foot on the shores of Virginia in 1607, what did they find? Endless forest, an unfamiliar climate, a dangerous uncertainty. Jamestown's first years were too brutal to romanticize. Starvation, disease, conflicts with the native peoples. The great majority of the first settlers did not survive, but those who remained, and they put down roots. 13 years later, in 1620, the Mayflower crossed the turbulent Atlantic and drew up to the shores of Massachusetts. Those who came this time were different. Puritans, people fleeing England's religious oppression, who wished to worship God on their own terms. Before landing, they signed a compact, the document that would go down in history as the Mayflower Compact. And in this simple act, the seed of something was planted, the idea that government must be founded upon the consent of the governed. That seed would blossom into a very different flower a century later. Throughout the 17th century, colonies grew, deepened, and diversified along the coastline. 13 colonies formed over the course of that century. These colonies were divided into geographic groups: New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. In the north, New England, towns shaped by a harsh climate, rocky soil, trade, and seafaring. In the middle, New York and Pennsylvania, centers where diversity, commercial vitality, and different faiths and cultures merged. In the south, an order stamped by tobacco and rice fields, grape plantations, and slave labor. These three regions were very different from one another, But they shared one thing. Over time, each colony established its own legislature, its own courts, its own local order, and the distance of England, the far side of an ocean, a relationship sustained by monthly letters, lent these local institutions genuine weight. The King and Parliament in London were very far away. The Assembly in Boston, however, was right there at the doorstep, and people learned to trust it. If you've enjoyed this video so far, make sure to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Mercantilism. Who won? Who lost? On the other side of the Atlantic, on the cobblestone streets of London, British parliamentarians and merchants frequently asked themselves this question: what is an empire good for? The answer, in their view, was perfectly obvious: producing wealth. And how that wealth was to be produced was equally plain. This economic belief system, called mercantilism, had planted itself at the very center of British statecraft by the middle of the 17th century. Its logic was as straight as a ruler. The colonies produce raw.
The first Navigation Act, passed during Oliver Cromwell's era in 1651, put this logic into law. All trade would be carried on English ships. The colonies could not trade directly with the Dutch, the French, or the Spanish. Every commodity, as if stubbornly choosing the long way around, would first pass through English ports. Over the years, new acts were layered on top of old ones, each closing the gaps created by its predecessor, each tightening the colonial economy a little further. On paper, yes, it made sense for both sides. England gained a secure source of raw materials and a guaranteed market. The colonists, in theory, were trading under the protection of the British Navy, with a reliable buyer. But in practice, the picture looked different, strikingly different. Consider a tobacco farmer in Virginia. He had worked his land, harvested his crop, prepared his bales, but he had no freedom to choose whom to sell them to. He could only sell to British merchants, which stripped him of all negotiating power from the outset. The same merchant who sold him thread, cloth, and farming tools also dictated English prices. The rules governing both buying and selling were set by someone else. The farmer was nothing but a pawn in this game, or a rum merchant in New England. His business was simple: buy molasses from the Caribbean and distill rum. But the molasses came from French islands, because those from the British Caribbean were too expensive. In theory, this was illegal. In practice, it was nearly a standard business model. Customs officials were silenced with bribe. The Navy could not perfectly surveil the Atlantic. England loomed across thousands of miles to Boston, but was never quite fully present. This gap, that inevitable gap in oversight created by geography, gave rise to the period historians call salutary neglect. During this era, lasting roughly from 1690 to 1763, England pursued a policy of systematic indifference toward its colonies. Was it deliberate? Partly. Was it necessary? To a great extent, but its consequences ran far deeper than either side had anticipated. The colonists breathed freely in this gap. They managed their own commerce. They made their own economic decisions. Smuggling Dutch tea, French molasses, Spanish goods became not merely a crime, but something close to a respectable occupation. Some of Boston's most prominent merchant families built their fortunes on this informal trade. John Hancock was the most famous of them. He was also the man who, in later years, would put his name on the Declaration of Independence and put it larger than anyone else's, with that much confidence in himself. And it is here, within the century-and-a-half sweep of mercantilism, that the fuse of 1773 was lit. The Tea Act of 1773 appeared, at first glance, to be good news for the colonists. The East India Company was granted the right to sell tea directly to the American market, which would lower prices. Tea could even be had more cheaply than the smuggled Dutch tea that had come in illegally. England's calculation was this: colonists love cheap tea. They'll swallow the tax. The crisis closes. But this calculation missed something. The colonists' anger was not about price. If it had been, cheap tea would have been a solution, but it wasn't. The problem was this: the tea tax left over from the Townshend Acts of 1767 was still in force. And who had imposed that tax? The British Parliament. The British Parliament, in which not a single representative of the colonists sat. To accept this tea was to tacitly acknowledge Parliament's authority to impose taxes without their consent. Hidden inside the cheap tea was a principle of staggeringly high cost. Boston's merchants read the situation the same way. The East India Company's monopoly privilege would put local tea merchants and smugglers out of business. Men like John Hancock knew this monopoly might begin with tea today and expand to other goods tomorrow. Commercial anxieties and political principles both took aim at the same target. When the ship Dartmouth dropped anchor in Boston Harbor in November 1773, it carried within its hold unfold, not only chests of tea, but 10 years of tension as well. It was only a matter of time before the long anger, one that had begun to be written in 1651, fed by each successive law, nourished by the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, finally overflowed. On the night of December 16th, approximately 116 people dressed in Mohawk garments marched at the wharf. They emptied 342 chests of tea into the harbor, approximately 46 tons, approximately 10,000 pounds sterling in value. They touched nothing else. 2 locks that were broken were afterward apologetically compensated for. The tidy geometric structure that mercantilism had spent over a century constructing raw materials from here, processing there, profit elsewhere, shattered that night in the cold waters of Boston Harbor. The legislative tradition, the roots of a right. It was the year 1619. In the Virginia heat, on the edge of the Jamestown settlement, 22 elected representatives came together. They had neither extensive experience of governance nor many procedures, but they sat, deliberated, made decisions, and dispersed. In that corner of history, there was no great fanfare, but that meeting room, the Virginia General Assembly, the House of Burgesses, was the womb of American political life. And in that womb, unknowingly, the seed of the night of 1773 was also taking root. The colonists had fled or separated from England, true, but they had carried the English political inheritance with them, not in their luggage, but in their minds, their language, their understanding of the law. And the most sacred piece of that inheritance was this: no person could be taxed without their consent, without the approval of their representatives. This idea was not abstract. It had a concrete historical foundation. The Magna Carta of 1215, the document by which England's barons compelled King John to sign, the document to which generations had looked as the moment when taxation was made subject to parliamentary approval, had been passed down for centuries. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 had reinforced it further. No taxation without representation. This was the very core of British political identity, valid for the king and the humblest peasant alike. The colonists did not merely know this principle, they lived it. Every colony had its own assembly: Massachusetts's General Court, Virginia's House of Burgesses, the Pennsylvania Assembly. Each had claimed and actually exercised deep authority over taxation, despite the distant English governor, sometimes even clashing with him. Local assembly meetings were not an abstract right, but the very substance of everyday political practice. For the colonist, the sentence "my own representatives must impose taxes" was not a theoretical principle. It was the natural expression of the political reality by which he lived his life. The ideas of John Locke, that the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the people, that the right of property is a natural and inalienable right, that resistance to tyranny is legitimate, circulated everywhere, in oral culture, in newspapers, in churches, in short, in every conceivable setting. In the taverns of commercial towns like Boston, in lawyers' large sitting rooms, in printers' ink-scented workshops, these ideas were debated. They were not the intellectual toys of an educated elite. They were a living political discourse passed. This idea was not abstract. It had a concrete historical foundation: the Magna Carta of 1215, the document by which England's barons compelled King John to sign, the document to which generations had looked as the moment when taxation was made subject to parliamentary approval had been passed down for centuries. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 had reinforced it further: no taxation without representation. This was the very core of British political identity, valid for the king and the humblest peasant alike. The colonists did not merely know this principle, they lived it. Every colony had its own assembly: Massachusetts's General Court, Virginia's House of Burgesses, the Pennsylvania Assembly. Each had claimed and actually exercised deep authority over taxation, despite the distant English governor, sometimes even clashing with him. Local assembly meetings were not an abstract right, but the very substance of everyday political practice. For the colonist, the sentence "my own representatives must impose taxes" was not a theoretical principle. It was the natural expression of the political reality by which he lived his life. The ideas of John Locke, that the legitimacy of government rests on the consent of the people, that the right of property is a natural and inalienable right, that resistance to tyranny is legitimate, circulated everywhere, in oral culture, in newspapers, in churches, in short, in every conceivable setting. In the taverns of commercial towns like Boston, in lawyers' large sitting rooms, in printers' ink-scented workshops, these ideas were debated. They were not the intellectual toys of an educated elite. They were a living political discourse passed on to craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and ordinary people. The Boston Gazette became the voice of the colonists. Samuel Adams wrote in its pages. John Dickinson's letters from a Pennsylvania farmer circulated from hand to hand across all the colonies. They laid out the unconstitutional rationality of the Townshend taxes so convincingly that even an ordinary farmer could understand and feel the argument. Through this, political consciousness ceased to be the monopoly of a class of lawyers. It became the common language of a broad colonial public. In 1765, the British Parliament, that parliament in which not one colonist had a representative, imposed taxes on newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, licenses, broadsides, even playing cards, on everything paper. Patrick Henry rose to his feet in the Virginia Assembly and thundered that taxation could only be carried out by colonial legislatures and that any other course was tyranny. The Stamp Act Congress that met in New York declared the same principle in more institutional language. No taxation without representation. This slogan was the long-carried political feeling, dating back to 1215, finally rendered into a slogan. The Stamp Act was repealed, but on that same day, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. Parliament possessed the authority to legislate for and tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The two sides were, in essence, looking at each other, but seeing different worlds. One saw imperial order, the other saw the violation of a 150-year political tradition. And so, on the night of December 16, 1773, thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House. This scene was no coincidence. The Meeting House, was the very center of New England political life. Here taxes were debated, local governance decided, social matters deliberated upon in the public arena. The spirit of that legislative tradition planted in Virginia in 1619 was here. It lived and trembled between the walls. In the breath of thousands of people, Samuel Adams addressed the crowd. One final message was sent to Governor Hutchinson. Send the ships back. Hutchinson refused. The messenger returned and conveyed the reply. Adams stood and spoke these words: "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." This sentence was the final period of a political consciousness that had been growing since 1619. The legitimate paths had been tried. Petitions, boycotts, assembly resolutions, congressional declarations, all had gone unanswered or had been reversed. They had demanded representation and been refused. And now, on that cold December night, approximately 116 people, dressed in Mohawk garments, marched to the wharf. They poured out the tea. They touched nothing else. This act was not merely a protest. It was the incarnation of something that had germinated in that modest meeting in Virginia in 1619, when elected representatives had gathered for the first time, the embodiment of the right of a people to govern themselves, the conviction that taxes could not be levied without representation, the living form of that deep political inheritance stretching from Magna Carta to Locke. The 7 Years' War and its consequences, 1756 to 1763, a conflict that began in 1756 between Prussia and Austria in Europe, grew in a short time in a way no one had anticipated. The North American front became known as the French and Indian War, and there, in those dense forests and river crossings, a young Virginian officer stepped onto the stage: George Washington. Washington served in this war under British command. He gained military experience, and he learned something far more important: how British officers regarded colonial soldiers, the condescending glances, the low pay, the colonial troops sleeping in the mud, while British officers enjoyed comfortable quarters. The victories won, at the cost of his own life, adorning the records of British generals. Washington was not alone in this observation. Thousands of Americans who bore arms in that war felt the same thing, and that feeling left a small but lasting sediment in their minds. We are their soldiers, but we are not of them. Victory, and the bill comes due in 1763. The Treaty of Paris was signed. England had achieved one of the greatest territorial gains in its history. Canada fell. The Mississippi Valley fell. Florida was wrested from rival Spain. The eastern half of the North American continent had, in effect, become England's. There was joy in London, but a great hole in the treasury. The 7-year global war had carried British national debt to approximately £130 million sterling. For that era, this figure was beyond imagination. The interest payments alone devoured a significant slice of the state budget every year. Moreover, these vast newly won lands needed to be governed and defended. The permanent deployment of British military units in North America was unavoidable. This was not a one-time expense, but a continuous, unending cost. The parliamentarians in London constructed a seemingly logical calculation. This war was also fought for the security of the colonies. The French threat had been eliminated. But what about the colonists? Were they making no contribution? Pontiac's rebellion and the closing of the West, the danger born, in the shadow of victories, intoxication, the summer of 1763 had not brought peace to North America. On the contrary, it was one of those strange thresholds where one war had closed and another was opening. The traditional balance of the Red Path. To understand this, one must go back a little and look at the fabric of of the French-native relationship. The French were different from the English. This difference must not be exaggerated. After all, they too were a colonial power. They too were after land. They too had come to this continent for their own interest. But their manner of forming relationships created a vital difference in practice. French fur traders were men who dared to plunge alone into the forest, who learned native languages, sometimes married native women, who tried to understand the culture from the inside. Jesuit missionaries had traveled among tribes for centuries, mingled with them, come to know their world at close range. France's presence in these lands rested, in large part, on this human network. It was built not only upon cannons and fortresses. This relationship did not satisfy all the tribe. It would be wrong to imagine that a paradise had ever been established between the French and the Native Americans. There were wars, deceptions, attempts at forced dispossession, but at least a balance existed. The French needed the fur trade, and this need gave the tribes a card to play, a ground on which they could negotiate on their own territory and on their own terms, could sometimes refuse, could conduct their commerce. Around the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Delaware, and many other communities had lived within this balance for decades. The chain of French forts was both a threat and a guarantee. It drew borders but also kept the trade routes open. The French gift-giving tradition, tools, gunpowder, and textile goods distributed at the New Year, was not merely a gesture but a symbolic and practical adhesive that kept the alliance alive. When 1763 arrived, this balance was demolished without remainder. The voice of Neolin, a prophet, emerges. Behind every great uprising, there is a figure who is overlooked. Armies find their place in history books. Prophets are usually relegated to footnotes, but occasionally, there are moments when words are sharper than swords. This message was far more than a purely religious summons. It framed everyday hardships, the cutting of gifts, the restriction of gunpowder, the arrogant officers in the forts, the pressure on their lands, in the language of the mystical, placing them within a universal frame of meaning. It spoke not of abstract principles, but of lived suffering, and people listened. Neolin's message spread quickly from tribe to tribe. When one of the Ottawa chiefs encountered this message, he listened with the workings of a great warrior's mind, and found in it the legitimizing ground for the anger he had been keeping within himself. His name was Pontiac. Pontiac, an architect of coalition. Precise historical information about Pontiac has been obscured by the shadow of romantic legend. Narratives written much later turned him into an almost mythological figure. The real man sometimes disappears beneath the legend, but this much is known. In 1763, Pontiac managed to build a coalition from dozens of tribes that spoke different languages, held different traditions, and had at times clashed with one another. This was no small feat. There were disagreements between the Ojibwe and the Ottawa. There were historical tensions between the Potawatomi and the Delaware. Some tribes wanted to continue trading with the British. Others, hoping the French would return, advocated a wait-and-see policy. By spring 1763, the plan was ready. The Siege of Detroit, May 1763. Fort Detroit was one of the most strategically important points in the Great Lakes region, and a British garrison was stationed there. Pontiac's plan was ingenious. Tribal warriors would enter the fort under the pretext of a peaceful meeting, draw the weapons they had concealed at exactly the right moment, and seize the fort from within. Suddenly, silently, the plan leaked. It was probably reported by a Native American woman. The historical record is unclear on this point, but the British commander had received a warning hours beforehand. Pontiac was stopped at the gate and not admitted. Thereupon, Pontiac shifted to open siege. Fort Detroit remained under siege for months. It would not fall without reinforcements, and Pontiac could not take it. But the uprising was not confined to Detroit. Throughout May and June 1763, coordinated attacks began along the chain of British forts. Fort Sandusky fell, Fort St. Joseph fell, Fort Miami fell, Presque Isle fell, Fort Edward Augustus was abandoned. The chain of British forts, stretching from the Great Lakes deep into Pennsylvania, was attacked one by one. Each had a different story. Some forts fell when their gates were opened under the pretext of negotiations, and the interior was taken over. Some forts, after long sieges, were forced to surrender when food and water ran out. At Fort Michilimackinac, a method recorded in history as the Bagatyway game was used. Groups of players playing a ball game in front of the fort's gate deliberately threw the ball inside. The players who ran in after the ball drew weapons they had concealed beneath their clothing. The garrison was caught completely off guard. Hundreds of British soldiers and civilians lost their lives in this period. Some accounts speak of 400 to 500 British soldiers killed and approximately 2,000 civilian settlers dead. For England, these numbers were both a military and a psychological shock. They had just emerged victoriously from a war that had shaken the world, and now the conquered lands seemed to be burning beneath their hands. Amherst's response, in a historical stain, Commander Amherst's stance toward these events is an extraordinarily dark page in historical terms. Amherst explicitly refused to negotiate with the tribes. He not only found their demands illegitimate, but also refrained from treating them as human enemies. At one point, in his correspondence, he discussed the idea of deliberately distributing cholera-infected blankets to the tribe. Historians still debate whether this idea was put into practice, but the very fact that such an idea emerged from the pen of a military commander is remarkable in itself. Amherst's stance was not only morally problematic, but strategically catastrophic. Harsh intervention tactics initially proved insufficient in suppressing the uprising. Conventional battle tactics did not work in the forests. British forces found themselves facing not an enemy that fought by the rules they knew, but a movement that refused set-piece battles, launched ambushes, retreated when beaten, and regrouped. Pontiac's war was not the war the British Army had been prepared for by European tradition, and this mismatch cost them months of blood and wasted time. By 1764, the uprising was still ongoing, but had lost its momentum. Several factors played a role simultaneously. It became ever clearer that the French were not returning. Pontiac had largely sustained this hope, but the terms of the Treaty of Paris were now plain. France would not return to these lands. One of the greatest forces holding the coalition together dried up. Some tribes, weighed down by the fatigue of the long war, became open to negotiation. The British were ultimately compelled to adopt a more flexible posture. The gift-giving tradition was partly restored. Some garrison commanders, guided by more conciliatory replacements for Amherst, opened channels of dialogue. Pontiac sat down for a ceasefire negotiation in 1766. This was not surrender. It was negotiation. Terms were set. The question of rights over the lands was discussed, and alliances were reframed. Pontiac was killed in 1769 by a member of the Peoria tribe, probably at the instigation of another tribe. His death, like his life, remains a matter of debate, but the mark he left endured deeply in both collective and individual memory. Continuing violence on the western frontier, the proclamation had drawn a line, but lines on paper do not change geographic reality. Settlers did not take the prohibition seriously. Migration westward could not be stopped. What authority could a piece of paper bearing an official seal have hundreds of miles away in the forests? Families walked, villages were founded, fields were cleared. The proclamation remained on paper, while reality sank into the soil. This actual settlement ceaselessly fed violence. Every family that poured westward brought with it a dispute. Some land could not be shared. Some hunting ground was trespassed. Some bad encounter turned into a chain of reprisals. British forces were not strong enough to maintain order across these vast lands. Besides, in London there was no money, no soldiers, no resources to maintain the distant garrisons. In short, the proclamation had made both colonists and tribes unhappy. For the tribes, it was a paper guarantee that remained on paper. For the settlers, it was an unnecessary and humiliating restriction. Both sides, for different reasons, had arrived at the same conclusion. This order was not working. The connection between all of this narrative, this complex picture stretching from Pontiac's rebellion to the closing of the West, and the tea of 1773 lay precisely here. London was simultaneously grappling with two different problems in North America. On one side, the land tensions and constantly simmering violence with the Native Americans. On the other, the astronomical war debt and the expected financial contribution from the colonists. The Proclamation of 1763 was trying to address the first problem. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts were addressing the second. This combination of dual anger created a social combustible, and the only thing men like Samuel Adams needed was a spark. Pontiac's rebellion usually appears as a footnote in history, but when you trace the ripples it created, the proclamation, the debt, the military burden, the colonial anger, you understand that the chests of tea poured into Boston Harbor were not only about tea, they were also about that closed door beyond the Appalachians. 1764. England took its first step on the path to taxing the colonies directly. The Sugar Act was, technically, not a new tax. It modified an existing molasses tax, and this time genuinely intended to enforce it. But what drew the real fury of the colonists was something else. Violations would be tried in special courts without a jury. That is, if a British customs official accused you, you would be tried not before a jury of your fellow colonists, but before a judge appointed by the British. This trampled on New England's rum production was fed by Caribbean molasses. This trade network sustained the livelihoods of dozens of small and medium-sized enterprises. The Sugar Act was constricting this network, raising costs, and on top of it all, stripping you of your legal protections. The colonial newspapers carried this act for months. Long articles, sharp critiques, legal analyses. The first political awakening was beginning, and the center of this awakening would, inevitably, be Boston. 1765. England proclaimed the Stamp Act. This act was different, very different. The previous tax acts affected trade, concerned merchants. The Stamp Act struck everyone. Newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, licenses, broadsides, even playing cards and dice. Everything touched by paper would bear a stamp carrying an English seal, and for each stamp, money would be paid. The response came on a scale England had never anticipated. In the Virginia Assembly, Patrick Henry rose to the podium. His voice trembled, but his words cut like a sharp blade. The right of taxation belongs only to the colonial legislature. Parliament has no authority to do this. Some delegates tried to stop him, but once words are mixed with the air, they cannot be taken back. In New York, delegates gathered. The Stamp Act Congress, representatives from 13 colonies worked for the first time in their lives, under one roof to discuss a shared matter. Their decision was clear: no taxation without representation. The name Sons of Liberty began to be heard. Stamp distributors were waited for in front of their homes and threatened, forced to resign. Some of their homes were damaged. Stamped papers were set alight in the public squares. A boycott of British goods was organized. Merchants swore to buy no British goods. Women wove their own cloth at home. They trusted not British imports but their own labor. England stepped back. In 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. The colonists greeted this retreat with joy, but on the very same day of that repeal, Parliament passed another act, the Declaratory Act. The message was plain: we took back the Stamp Act. Yes, but we possess the right to legislate for and tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever, and we will never surrender that. The joy was shadowed by unease. 1767. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, made a new move. The colonists had objected to internal taxes, but what about external taxes? Glass, paper, lead paint, tea. If external customs duties were applied to these, would the colonists have any ground to complain? The colonists rejected the distinction. A tax was a tax, whether collected internally or externally. What mattered was that it was collected without their consent. John Dickinson's letters from a Pennsylvania farmer circulated from hand to hand across all the colonies. It explained, in clear and simple language, that the Townshend taxes were equally unconstitutional. Everyone read them: merchants, farmers, tradespeople. The Massachusetts Assembly sent a circular letter to the other colonies: let us stand together. England found this letter seditious and forced the Assembly to rescind it. This poured oil on the flames. 1768. British military units were deployed to Boston. Soldiers in redcoats began patrolling the city streets. When the barracks were not enough, they were billeted in private homes, at the market, in the church, at the bakery, those redcoats everywhere. An atmosphere of occupation. And that atmosphere was inevitably preparing an explosion. March 5, 1770. The weather in Boston was cold. A crowd had gathered on King Street. The tension with the soldiers had escalated, particularly that day. Curses, stones, chunks of ice. The soldiers felt they were cornered. Then the guns fired. 5 people were killed. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a former slave, a detail that would later acquire symbolic power. One of the first to shed blood for freedom was someone who had himself been deprived of freedom. Paul Revere made an engraving depicting the scene. Dramatic, deliberately exaggerated, but enormously effective. This image was printed again and again in colonial newspapers, copied by hand, and hung in homes. The name Boston Massacre spread from tongue to tongue. John Adams, ironically, this was a name that would later become one of the leaders of the Revolution, defended the soldiers in court because the rule of law required it, he said, and most of the soldiers were acquitted. The crowd's provocative behavior was considered a mitigating circumstance, but public opinion had already delivered a different verdict. England, in the wake of this event, repealed most of the Townshend Act, but one tax remained, for symbolic reasons, to register Parliament's authority to tax: the tea tax, the Tea Act, and the road to crisis. The East India Company, the fall of a giant in the early 1770s, the colonies settled into a relative quiet, but this was a silence born of exhaustion, not of peace. Within that silence, something was being organized: the committees of correspondence. In every colony, in every major town, leading activists colonists built networks that kept each other informed. Samuel Adams was among the architects of this network, so that voices not scatter, bonds not break, anger not be forgotten. And now, in 1773, a new spark struck from an unexpected direction. From London, Britain's greatest trading company, the East India Company, was on the brink of bankruptcy. This company had an extraordinary history. It had built empires in Asia, brought India under control, been the architect of intercontinental trade. But this magnificence brought with it an unmanageable complexity, a decaying bureaucratic structure, inadequate financial oversight, and on top of it all, a management disaster. By the 1770s, the company's warehouses held approximately £17 million worth of unsold tea shipped from India, waiting in English warehouses, finding no buyers, tons upon tons of it. If the company went bankrupt, the English economy would be shaken. But even more importantly, the East India Company was the fundamental pillar of England's presence in India. Its collapse would mean political and geopolitical catastrophe. The government had to find a solution. The cheapness that came with the trap. 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. The plan seemed elegant. The East India Company would be given the right to sell tea directly to American colonies, bypassing continental European middlemen. Significant tax reductions would be granted to the company, enabling it to sell tea at a competitive price. The result, tea prices in the colonies would fall. American consumers would drink tea more cheaply. How could this be bad? But clear-eyed people looked beyond the arithmetic of opportunity, and they saw this. The tea tax left over from the Townshend era was still in force. Tea would be sold cheaply, yes, but together with this tax. If the colonists bought this tea, they would have effectively accepted Parliament's authority to tax them. The gains of years of resistance would have been squandered for a cup of cheap tea. Samuel Adams saw this calculation more sharply than anyone. He wrote, he spoke, he explained. This is a trap. The cheapness is the price of submission. Those who opposed the Tea Act were not only principled activists. Local tea merchants had panicked who could stand against the enormous monopoly power of the East India Company. Small merchants, smugglers, independent importers, all of their livelihoods were under threat. For these merchants, the issue was not principle, but bread. Political activists read the act as a cunning maneuver designed to consolidate the taxing authority. Middle-class merchants carried a broader anxiety. If the company monopoly started with tea today, it might expand to other goods tomorrow. By this logic, the entire commercial structure could be in danger, and these different angers converged at a single point. In Philadelphia, the tea ship was turned back before it could approach the harbor. In New York, the captain was told plainly, "Do not bring your ship." In Charleston, the tea was brought ashore but locked in warehouses, not offered for sale. In Boston, however, the situation was different. Governor Hutchinson, the man who refused to compromise Thomas Hutchinson, was no ordinary governor. He was a distinguished historian. He had written comprehensive books on the history of Massachusetts. He was a member of a wealthy merchant family, and as governor of Massachusetts, he seemed like someone who could mediate between the colonists and the British government, someone who could understand both sides. But his perspective prevented this. Moreover, there was a significant conflict of interest. His brother and son-in-law were among the appointed tea consignees of the East India Company in Boston. If the tea sold, his family would profit. Hutchinson refused to yield to any compromise. The ships were in Boston Harbor, and they were not leaving. British law was clear. The ships were required to pay customs duties within 20 days. Otherwise, the cargo could be seized. Hutchinson would not permit departure without the tax being paid. The colonists refused to pay the tax. Sending the tea back was impossible, and the deadline of that legal period was approaching. December 16, 1773. There was no solution, or the solution was in Samuel Adams's mind, and it would come that night. It was on such a ground that the Boston Tea Party took root. On top of 150 years of colonial history, more than a century of political maturation, and decades of accumulated anger, the tea poured into Boston Harbor on that cold December night was no gesture made in a vacuum. It was an answer to the question of how the people living in North America saw themselves, an answer whose roots stretched all the way back to 1607, to the muddy soil of Jamestown, and to the stormy Atlantic of 1620. And the night of December 16, 1773, was not a spontaneously erupted uprising. Behind that cold winter night lay meticulous planning woven days in advance, and the architects of this planning were two of Boston's most recognizable faces. Samuel Adams possessed a rare political genius, capable of directing crowds like a river. He had elevated propaganda to the level of an art, an activist who grasped instinctively how words and symbols could ignite a popular movement. Adams, the actual brain of the Sons of Liberty, had spent years fighting against British tax policies. He had always understood that political change is possible only when the ground is prepared. And now, that ground was more ready than it had ever been. Paul Revere, alongside him, was a different profile entirely. The hands skilled at the silversmith's bench carried messages on horseback across the colonies when needed. He had won the trust of ordinary people through his craftsman's identity, and through his role as a courier had become the nervous system of the organization. The task he took on for that night was both practical and symbolic: to gather people, to ensure coordination, to make sure every link in the plan was in its proper place. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: no violence, no bloodshed, only a single objective. The tea chests in the holds of 3 ships would be cast into the sea. Beyond that, nothing would be touched. This was not ordinary vandalism. It was a carefully designed political message. The question of identity, too, had been thought through. Participants with that night were Mohawk native garments. There was a practical reason for this, of course, to conceal their faces against possible British reprisal. But this disguise carried a far deeper meaning. A colonist wearing Mohawk garments was in that moment proclaiming to the world, "I am no longer British. I am a person of this land." Hours before the action, that morning, Boston's pulse was beating at the Old South Meeting House. The building was bursting. Thousands of people who had pressed in from the streets stood crammed shoulder to shoulder, waiting. There was in the air both an anger and a taut expectation. Everyone sensed that something was approaching, but no one yet knew exactly what would happen. The formal purpose of the meeting was this: to ask Governor Thomas Hutchinson one final time. The tea-laden ships were still in harbor. The colonist demand was clear: let the ships return. Let them go back to England without being unloaded. If this demand were accepted, the crisis might perhaps close without bloodshed. A messenger set out toward Hutchinson's location. The meeting waited. The city waited. History waited. The answer came: no. Governor Hutchinson was resolute. The ships could not leave the harbor without permission. There was nowhere to go without the tax being paid and the tea unloaded. Samuel Adams rose to his feet. His voice reached every corner of the hall. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Those words were not a manifesto. They were a signal flare. The organizers waiting outside already knew what to do when they heard these words. The night was beginning. After the meeting dispersed, the city settled into a strange silence. But this was the silence before the storm. Approximately 116 to 130 participants, though some sources give higher numbers. The true count of that night remains a subject of historical debate. Gathered in a hidden location, they put on their Mohawk garments and the paint that covered their faces. Now neither were their identities visible, nor was there any turning back. They walked toward the wharf in groups, by different routes, at different moments, without drawing attention. But in Boston that night, no one had closed their eyes. On the wharf, a large crowd was waiting. People watching silently, looking on with sympathy. People standing there to be witnesses to history. Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. 3 ships, lying in harbor, awaiting their fate. Security was either lax, or perhaps more tellingly, was being deliberately ignored. The activists boarded the ships. The crowd watched. No one stopped them. On deck, everything proceeded according to plan. The chests were brought up from the holds and carried one by one to the deck. They were broken open. The tea within, that valuable tea bearing the seal of the English India Company, symbolizing Parliament's fair price, was thoroughly soaked before being cast into the sea. This detail mattered, so it would not scatter, so it would not float on the harbor. Some accounts tell that the activists broke up the tea, mixed with water using oars, to make sure it sank. 342 chests, approximately 46 tons of tea. An eyewitness present there that night recorded the following: no one was harmed, except a guard. Only 2 locks, in 2 places holding water, were broken. An apology was offered for one whose door was accidentally slightly damaged by bumping. One must grasp the weight of these sentences. Dozens of people, for hours, carried out a major act of economic sabotage, and the damage they left: 2 broken locks and a door scratch. They were sorry about the broken lock. They apologized. This was the aesthetic of an uprising: goal-oriented, controlled, principled. A British naval ship lay in the harbor's open waters. On its deck, an admiral watched the entire night. He had no orders. He did not fire. Within a few hours, the work was done. The activists came ashore, walked away, and silently dispersed. The participants were largely successful in concealing their identities. Among them were silversmiths, carpenters, craftsmen, and merchants, students, professional men, prosperous traders. This diversity was no accident. It carried the real message of that night. This movement was the voice not only of the oppressed but of a broad cross-section of society. What united them was neither purely commercial interest nor abstract political principles. What united them was a shared identity, people who no longer felt themselves British but American, who thought they belonged to this land, who knew that being taxed without representation was an affront to their dignity. Their names came to light only decades later, through memoirs and carefully preserved confessions. London was furious. In early 1774, the British Parliament passed in quick succession the acts the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts, officially the Coercive Acts. The Boston Port Act seized the harbor. Until the price of the tea was paid, Boston's connection to the sea would be severed. The Massachusetts Government Act purged elected officials, replacing them with appointed ones. The Administration of Justice Act built a shield protecting British officials from being tried in colonial courts. The Quartering Act required colonial buildings to be open to British soldiers, and the Quebec Act attached the disputed Ohio Valley to Quebec Province. For colonists who wanted to push westward, this was a closing gate. The calculation behind these laws was crush Boston, intimidate, and subdue the other colonies. But the calculation proved wrong. Pressure produced not compliance but unity. Colonists who had until then been relatively quiet joined the ranks of the movement. Everywhere the same question began to circulate: which colony is next? In September 1774, 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. Georgia accepted. Georgia's reason for not coming is a separate story. That southern colony, because of its dependence on British support, was not yet ready to take this step. At the First Continental Congress, the delegates united. A complete boycott of British goods was decided upon. If conditions did not change, exports from America to England would halt as well. A declaration was issued. Rights and grievances. The colonists still considered themselves British citizens. The language of full independence had not yet been openly spoken, but there was now a common voice and a common identity. April 1775, British forces marched toward the arms depots at Concord. At Lexington, they encountered the Minuteman militia. The first gunshots rang out. History would call that shot the shot heard round the world. 17 months had passed since the Boston Tea Party. For 17 months, reconciliation had still seemed possible, or at least there were those who held hope. But the coercive acts closed the door on that hope. The Continental Congress wove a new bond, and when Lexington smelled of gunpowder, independence ceased to be a speculative idea and became an inevitable destination. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense. He explained the absurdity of monarchy and the value of republicanism to hundreds of thousands of people in plain language. Public opinion ripened. July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, brought to life by Thomas Jefferson's pen, was adopted by Congress. Locke and natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness behind these words. The sound of the 342 chests of tea poured into the sea on a cold Boston night long before could be heard. No taxation without representation. That thought had found an action in the act of that night, and in the Declaration of Independence it had reached its most mature and formal expression. The Boston Tea Party was neither an accident nor the product of a moment's anger. It was the most dramatic expression of an organized resistance, a meticulous plan, and a rising identity. And the waves of that night continued to strike the shore for decades afterward. On the night of December 16, 1773, the sound of the 342 chests of tea cast into the sea at the wharf had barely faded when news began to spread rapidly. But this spreading was not from Philadelphia, however, rose a more cautious but equally sharp voice. Benjamin Franklin looked at the event through the lens of intelligent political strategy and was, for precisely this reason, unsettled. Because, in Franklin's view, the property that had been destroyed belonged to the East India Company, meaning that in this equation, where Parliament policy was to blame, there could be no claim to the moral high ground without compensating the private company for its losses. Franklin wrote from London that the colonists needed to pay reparations, otherwise they would appear in the eyes of the British public as common looters. John Adams, meanwhile, poured these lines into his diary on the morning of December 17th, lines that continue to glow on the pages of history today. I consider this event a great epoch. The principle has been asserted with boldness, intrepidity, and determination. For Adams, what mattered was not the sacrifice of the tea, but the message that emerged from the sacrifice of the principle. The social reverberations were no less evident than the political debates. Tea, previously no more than a beverage, swiftly transformed into a moral and political symbol. Now a colonist who raised a teacup to his lips was perceived, whether aware of it or not, as accepting British subjugation. Coffee, chamomile, tea, and other beverages brewed from native plants became the drink of patriots. The search for alternatives to tea organized itself spontaneously at meetings, in homes, in taverns. This cultural transformation must not be underestimated. The politicization of an everyday ritual was the most natural and lasting path for an idea to enter the home of the ordinary person. For King George III and Prime Minister Lord North in London, the news from Boston carried a very clear message. Authority was being tested, and if no response was given, the other colonies would be emboldened. Indeed, the British response was both swift and harsh. In the early spring of 1774, the British Parliament passed several laws in quick succession. The colonists gave these laws the name Intolerable Acts. Their official name was the Coercive Acts. The Boston Port Act delivered the most direct blow. The act closed Boston Harbor entirely until the full price of the tea was paid. This decision was a death sentence for Boston's economy, which depended on maritime commerce. Merchants were left without work. Ships waited at the wharf. Workers found themselves without income. An entire city was being economically strangled. London had designed these laws to extinguish the spark, but it obtained precisely the opposite. The Coercive Acts served as the perfect trigger for those who had grievances but had not considered taking action. Colonists who had been relatively quiet, conciliatory perhaps, thinking their problems with England could be resolved through negotiation. These people changed sides with these laws. The consciousness that they are not on the side of the wrongdoer. We are spread to ever wider audiences with each passing month. The Coercive Acts had created a diffuse anger across the colonies. But the strength of anger did not mean effectiveness. Each colony was operating with its own dynamics, its own priorities. Coordination was lacking, and this lack could squander the opportunity. In September 1774, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Chosen or appointed figures from 12 colonies, Georgia accepted, came together at this critical juncture of history in the same hall. This meeting was called the First Continental Congress, and for many participants, this was their first deep contact with people from other colonies. Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, John Dickinson from Pennsylvania. These men did not know each other well, did not fully understand each other's problems, but the Coercive Acts had united them on common ground. Congress resolved on a complete boycott of British goods. If conditions did not change, exports from America to England would also be halted. These decisions were not merely an economic move, they were also the declaration of a collective will. The declaration drafted by Congress struck a remarkably careful balance. The colonists defined themselves as British citizens, claiming the rights that derived from English law. The language of full independence had not yet been openly voiced, but between the lines of the declaration, the seeds of a profound rupture were germinating. The real importance lay in the symbolic dimension of the Congress. People from different colonies had for the first time acted within a common identity. The concept of American had not yet been born in its full sense, but the birth pangs had begun. By the spring of 1775, hopes for reconciliation had faded considerably. British forces had for some time been tracking colonial arms depots and ammunition stores. When in April 1775, they moved to destroy the arms depots at Concord, something was waiting for them. The Minuteman militia. That morning, at Lexington, two armed groups faced each other, and the moment historians still debate who fired first occurred. That first shot fired was recorded in history as the shot heard round the world. The dead fell. There was no going back. The 17 months between the Boston Tea Party and Lexington were not pure silence, but they were a limbo in which the rupture had not yet been formalized, in which the door to reconciliation remained theoretically open. The Coercive Acts closed that door. The Continental Congress wove a new bond, and when Lexington smelled of gunpowder, independence ceased to be a speculative idea and became an inevitable destination. The end of 1775 and the beginning of 1776 was the period when ideas were transformed into political decisions. In this process, the most critical influence came from a small pamphlet. Thomas Paine, a writer of English origin, published his piece titled Common Sense in January 1776. Paine's pen was sharp, his language plain, and his argument clear. Monarchy was an absurdity. The human mind could not accept as a source of legitimacy a title obtained merely by birth. Republican governance, as an order based on the consent of the people, was the only realistic alternative. This pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It was read aloud to those who could not read, debated in taverns, shared in churchyards. The idea of independence was no longer confined to the salons of intellectual elites. It had reached broad popular masses. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document had been given life largely by Thomas Jefferson's pen. This text, bearing the Lockean philosophy of natural rights, proclaimed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as inalienable rights. But to grasp the true weight of this document, one had to go back 10 years. The taxation disputes that began in 1763, the principle that there shall be no taxation without representation, the idea of legitimate authority based on the consent of the people. The most mature, most formal expression of all this accumulated weight took concrete form in that document of July 4th. The tea poured into Boston Harbor was, in truth, the opening paragraph of this great manifesto. Measuring the event by its material value is easy. Approximately 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea was destroyed in a single night's action. This was a considerable price, but in strategic terms, it was not decisive. England could easily absorb this loss. The true importance lay in the meaning and message the event carried. The colonists were declaring to the world, rather than submit to the taxation policy of the British Parliament, which they regarded as illegitimate, they were capable of choosing to suffer economic loss. This was not merely a commercial calculation. It was an existential stance. The matter of the Mohawk garments deserves separate attention. The practical advantage of concealing identity is plain, but in this choice lay a deeper symbolism as well. The participants were positioning themselves as New World people, rooted in American nature, independent of the British. The language of, "We are no longer your extension. We are the people of this land," was hidden within that garment in a supremely visual form. The image of the Boston Tea Party continued to leave deep traces in American political culture. The Tea Party movement that emerged at the beginning of the 21st century consciously borrowed its name and its direct action tradition from this event. The same framework was redeployed to oppose government intervention and question taxation policies. Remember to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We truly value your thoughts, so share them in the comments. Help shape our upcoming videos with your ideas. From a drop of tea to freedom. The Boston Tea Party, examined in isolation, is merely a protest, but evaluated within the entirety of the decade's arc, it carries a far deeper meaning. Over the 10 years stretching from 1763 to 1773, the colonists were continually tested. Each time they resisted, organized, and responded. The Boston Tea Party became the most striking and most visible act of this cumulative process. It turned into a turning point that made what followed inevitable. The tea poured onto the wharf on that November night represented not merely a British imported beverage. It represented more than a century and a half of accumulating subjugation, the weight of an authority imposed from outside, and the usurpation of a people's right to have a say in their own fate. And the step taken on that night was the first bold step in the history of a new nation that, shortly thereafter, would win its independence from one of the world's most powerful empires. It was not the tea itself, but the very will required to cast the tea into the sea that lit the fuse of freedom.